Hi, so I'm Jennifer Davis. And I feel like we got to recover some of the energy here because I know this is the last talk of the day. So I want to hear some energy. Hello. Hello. Okay, that's much better. We're awake now. Okay, cool. So hi, I'm Jennifer Davis. I am one of the co-authors of Effective DevOps from O'Reilly. I am also a senior site reliability engineer at realself, a really awesome site. A lot of the folks are based out of Seattle. I'm also the mom of Frankie. Little known fact, the last time I was at this conference speaking, I was pregnant. That is the little person that is now almost 2. Yes, definitely a yay. So earlier this year, I joined the company realself. I joined the SRE team specifically. One of the challenges that I found really interesting about this team was that they adventured into the future with adopting new technology. They weren't afraid to experiment. Ed has come and spoken at DevOpsDays Portland in the past. He's also spoken at in Seattle as well as Silicon Valley. And it inspired me because I was like, here is this team doing really interesting things. They're not afraid to experiment with the latest and greatest while also supporting their current technology stack. I hadn't worked a lot with serverless at that point, because I was working at Chef, and so that's not something that they had a solution for. So I want to share today some of my observations as I've dug into this new-to-me technology. I want us together to examine what it means and how it's impacting the roles that we have. I posit that operations is a skill that is becoming more important and not less important. We're evolving skills that we all need for our applications to run the way that we expect them to run. One of the things I feel is critical about operations is that we are monitoring the risk to the business. And by that, I don't mean our pagers. Like, none of us are interested in being paged, although, well, some of us like to be paged. I don't. And so I'm not talking about carrying a pager. I'm talking about maximizing the value of what we get on our returns of the money that we spend, as well as minimizing the impact of compromised systems. We have to think about this as operations folks and keep the business making money. It doesn't matter whether someone is a developer or whatever role of operations you have, whether it's SRE or sysadmin or IT operations, or if you're a tester. All of these roles matter in the org, and you can do operations work if you have the motivation and skills to do it. As the technology evolves, the specific skills that we do change, but we still need these roles in our environments. When I look at successful teams in media, this is from the show Bones. When I was recovering from the state of being pregnant, I watch a lot of TV shows, and one of the things I saw is these teams and how they interacted. And yes, there's like cool technology that people use, but when people aren't available, the other team members step up to the plate, use the technology, but they're not as good or as effective with it. So like, for example, Angela went out on maternity leave, and people were like, oh, how are we going to figure out what this person looks like, who it is? The team doesn't break apart. And yet, every time I see these ideas that, oh, it's cool, we're going to automate away this particular role. I've seen it happen with testing, and now it's operations. Like, people are like, we can make it so you don't really need to do testing anymore. That's not the case, as we learned earlier today, right? So in my team at realself, we have a responsibility for site reliability engineering across the company. But we're also designated to specific sprint teams with a particular role for a particular business value. And so we provide mentorship and leadership to core values of being an employee at realself to help everyone on the team level up their operation skills. There's very few things where we say, you shall not do this. And those are things that, like, that would totally break us. And our software development engineers are the first line when you get paged. And incidentally, our managers also go on call as incident commanders. So everybody is invested in learning these operation skills. So what does it mean to be in operations? Like, there's so much that doesn't get encompassed by what is defined by certain tools. What we do at realself, in part, this doesn't encompass everything, is capacity management. We have to think about how we're spending money, where we're going to spend money, how can we save money, what is it that we're doing? What does our security look like? We work together with our security team to make sure that we are following recommended practices. What does our service health look like? And that changes. It doesn't stay static. It's always changing as we introduce new services and retire old services. We worry about networking and databases and incident response and disaster planning. We have to know how to do all of this. And yet, we're not going to do ops anymore? How many people have to worry about these kind of pieces in their infrastructure? Right? It matters. And in some teams, there's like large teams, you might have dedicated teams to individual pieces of the stack. And I consider them operations, like database operability, that's still operations. We need expertise in this, we're not losing this. So then what is it that we're talking about when we talk about serverless? The ops in the serverless, let's define serverless. Well, maybe serverless is PagerDuty because it's this really cool service I use, and I set up schedules, and I can look at it and see who's on call. It's a specific function, but I don't have to worry about the servers that are underneath. And so maybe that's serverless. Or maybe it's Datadog, because I can get this visibility into all my systems. I no longer have to run a separate metrics collection and analyze everything. I can just send my information and collect it with any of the integrations they have and see this pane of information. Maybe serverless is my hosted CI environment. Now, I do specify what my environment is, like whether I'm using a Docker container or a machine executor. But I don't have to manage the systems underneath. I'm not getting paged. All of these things are serverless. Really. And ops people love this stuff. We totally want this stuff to work because we're out of the data center. We're not hosting systems and going in there with all our little plugins and extra CDs and DVDs for operating systems. I finally threw away a bunch of stuff this past year because I was like, I don't need this anymore. We care of making the systems work reliably. It doesn't matter so much how we're doing it, whether it's with servers that we go set up, the cloud, or serverless. We just want it to work the way that it needs to work, and we need that insight. So really, when we talk about serverless, there's kind of two camps, and there's the BAS and the FAS. And I'm going to talk specifically more about the FAS elements here, and that's the function as a service. Amazon kind of introduced us to this with Lambda. And if you look at AWS serverless presentations, you'll see a few points that are repeated over and over again. There's no servers to provision, it scales with usage, you never pay for idle, and availability and tolerance, it's magic. Like, sprinkle some magic on this. I think that we need to actually clarify some of what they're saying here, because I think people interpret it to mean different things, especially when people are like, yay, no ops needed. So when they say no servers to provision, people conflate this to no infrastructure to maintain. And that's completely incorrect, because you still need to know all the resources that you're going to use, what they're going to do, who has access to them, how they're going to get configured. I love the fact that I don't have to get paged to go upgrade OpenSSL when there's a vulnerability. That's amazing. I don't care about that. That's not part of my application. That's not direct to my business value. But serverless doesn't eliminate my operability concerns about my resources. We need to isolate how things are built. I just went to AWS Community Day and heard a bunch of talks about how great serverless is for developers. And that same greatness makes it so great for attackers. It makes it so easy to attack the vulnerabilities in your system. So another thing, scaling. Yeah, scaling is magical. One of the limitations that we had originally was you have this infrastructure, you would figure out all the steps. It would take ages to get approvals, potentially, depending on your organization, buy that hardware, it gets shipped. But see, then the developer receives the hardware and they start using it and they use as much as they want, and magically they can use as little or as much as they want. And that cost is like, we inherit that cost. Now the greatness is we only pay what we use, and the company that is hosting our serverless, whether it's Amazon or Microsoft or Google, is now handling all the implementation details. We don't have to get involved in saying no to like those particular costs, but it's still, now the application developer has to determine how are we going to scale? Are we going to successfully scale? Does it actually work? There's this concept of you never pay for idle. Well, what if your application is doing the wrong thing and you're actually invoking the app and spending resources, but this is another plus to the quality of the software that you're writing. We need to know that we're really idling. Again, I don't have to worry about this anymore. I remember being at Yahoo and we would have these big pushes to spend a lot of time analyzing our utilization. It was like, well, we're not using CPU on this, we're actually using disk. We would spend all the cycles. Well, now, as an ops person, I don't have to care about idle systems because somebody else is caring about it. I get to focus on the value that I can bring to the org. Then, the availability. This is a very interesting concept because it totally just works. But this comic is so applicable because everything is events, everything is event-driven. And when something goes wrong, and it really goes wrong, you're kind of like, how do I fix this? Where do I even start? And I'll tell a little bit about my first experience with serverless and feeling like, well, it's running, but what is this mess? And I really felt like this. So the perceived benefits and what makes CFOs and CTOs happy is that we're simplifying the operational model and we're paying for what we use. We're going to save a ton of money. What I actually see is that we manage control. And what I mean by this is you get a choice as an operations person to be, yes, I don't care about this. It can run in the serverless. Or, and like, I'm not going to worry about the infrastructure, or I need to have more control over this, and so we're going to build this application together on instances or Docker containers. It's a choice that we get. We also can reduce our costs, but things like doing a constant polling job that keeps our serverless functions warm, that's kind of wasted work, so maybe we're not reducing costs as much as we think we are. And so we still have to do budget concerns to make sure we're spending the money the way that we expect to spend it, and that there isn't more value doing instances themselves. So there are a few challenges. You can't just go, okay, I'm going to take my ops and bring it over to the serverless and it's just going to work. One of the first things I saw was application lifecycle. It's completely changed. It's not the way that I think of it, and like, it really doesn't matter anymore. I can quickly deploy a new serverless function, and it's completely new, and it doesn't matter. So there's less concern there, and that's kind of messes with my mind, because so much I've thought about is the application lifecycle. How is it born? How do we change it? How do we kill it gracefully? But then there's also this challenge of the visibility and monitoring. I don't get all the benefits of long-lived systems. I'm used to being able to see metrics that tell me, oh, that push that you just put out is actually bad because the utilization numbers have changed in these ways. We're no longer looking at that kind of information. So how do we actually do that part of the operability? Like, people are just making changes, deploying them very fast. And so it's like, how do we change what we've done in the past? Sure, AWS gives you some metrics, and then third-party services will totally take those metrics and give them back to you in the same way. You actually have to think hard about what you need to measure, how you need to measure it, what logs you need to generate. And when I've polled people, I don't get a lot of confidence that we are doing this yet. So it feels like this is a very early stage level of things, and that we could apply a lot more skill to this, because we need more than this when we're debugging things. What I've seen is useful is applying serverless to these types of applications. Some people are like, you can do serverless for everything. It really feels like these are where we have solid use cases, and these are where we use them at realself. And I want to be clear, I totally love serverless. It's not like, oh, hate on the serverless. I think that it's really good for specific applications, and these are those kind of applications. If you want to introduce additional risk in your application without thinking about capacity planning or permissions management or roles isolation, sure, don't do an evaluation. Don't think about these things. But yeah, it is good for some things. So let me talk a little bit about my first serverless experience. So there was this problem with an application, and I started digging into it. And the nice thing about serverless is specifically the step functions on AWS console. You get to see this nice big graph of the model of what's happening. The problem with this is you get it after the fact. You don't get to mess around with this model beforehand to figure out, does it do the thing that I want it to do? It's kind of like I code, I deploy, and I observe the changes. And as long as everything's green, everything's good. But the minute that you have a single failure, it starts looking bad. And I basically spent hours deploying changes, watching the changes as it flowed down this little graph. And then I got some help to figure out, oh, I can actually log into this serverless server, because that's how you debug things, is tracing through, like finding the identifier, going into the console, identifying the server. And this is how I discovered that concurrency matters, and you can have functions that get into this weird state. And we had between like 5 and 16 MySQL instances starting up at the same time. They were trying to build themselves all at the same time, so most of them would fail. So it would fail the whole thing. And for a large table, that can be a problem. So recommendations to how you can add some of the operability that I've seen into that the possibilities that you have. Don't use the AWS console. Like, almost every tutorial out there is like, first, go to the AWS console and do these things. And like, developers will get really excited, like, oh, look, I can do this thing, and it's magical. And then you're like, no. Because the reality is you need a framework. Choose a framework, base it on whatever language you're using. That's the whole point of this. Is serverless is a real awesome DevOps tool. You get your devs, you get your ops, you get your testers, you get your security people all working together on the same project. It's all in the code right there. You got your, like for the serverless framework, you've got your serverless YAML, and then you got your handlers in your code. So the value of version control is there. Like, we know it. We can embrace it. And choosing a framework and not the console makes all the difference, because then we can collaborate. We get the business continuity, and we can manage the risk of change, which is, again, the whole value of operations is monitoring our risk. If everybody's doing shit in the console, I can't monitor that. Like, you're never leaving. Like, you deploy something into production in the console, that's your new job. You've got to know all of the resources that you're going to use and get them into your serverless config for the serverless framework, or whichever framework you're going to use. Declare them all up front. Also make sure that your KMS is a standalone configuration so that you can, when you have a state of a breakdown, you don't lose your ability to encrypt and decrypt information. And again, this is so critical. IAM policies need to be reviewed by whoever is your security team. That might be your operations people, your SREs, it might be a security team. You need to understand this because this is such a critical element, and I'm terrified now of all things of IAM policies because of the red team talks from yesterday. Know your limits. There's specific limits, and it bites everyone. And don't cross your streams of Node.js and Python, because that adds to things. Every time you're building and deploying serverless, you're bundling all of the plugins that you need, because you don't get anything for free, right, except for the server. So you have to put everything together. The other thing is serverless magically can version everything underneath you, and you can quickly get to the 75 gig limit per region. And so clean up your versioned elements, because if you're using version control, you already have those versions in your version control repository. So I keep seeing this is the end of operations, no ops, like the advent. And I feel like that's just people wanting to talk about something and get value about it. I cared passionately about operations, and I want to encourage all of you to push back on these people who are saying no operations anymore, because as I've talked about, it's obvious we need operations. It's only going to get more critical. We can all pursue the knowledge and skills that are part of operations. It doesn't mean that we need operations people with that role. We can all be developers. I don't care what my title is. I just like to do the interesting work. But we do need people who specialize in this specific perspective that are going to look at how we build applications and spend the time evaluating it, just like we need people spending time testing. It's kind of like we have all these algorithms and solutions for code, so are we going to basically say there's no dev? I don't care. I really don't care about naming my servers and managing them. I'm fine running serverless and having someone else get paid for them, right? I still am going to get paid for the business value of my application. I still need to care. So when people say no ops, I want you to tell them it's more dots. Developers, database, design, operations, testers, security. We need more dots, not less ops. Ops love serverless. And that doesn't matter if it's PagerDuty or Datadog or some other third-party service that's going to come along next. But we also need for companies to expend the energy for operations advocacy. We need for the tools that are coming to care about how we as operations, as testers, as security, implement and use these tools. Too often, it's not paid attention to, and so we, the cobblers of glue, put these things together and make it work. So if I've gotten you interested in serverless, there's a serverless conference happening next week. If you don't have a ticket, there's a few tickets left. You can get 20% off with the code serverless20. There's also one in Seattle coming up October 4th. And I want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this talk with you. I'm super passionate about it. And if you're passionate about it too, have thoughts and feels you want to share about it, please do email me at serverless@awesomedevops.com.